All right, everybody. I got Peter Rogers, MD, with me today. We're going to be talking about, I guess it is dementia. You said dementia, and is it Alzheimer's or just dementia?
Yeah, we can talk about a little bit of both, preventing dementia.
Okay. And then I also had asked you guys some questions or asked what questions you wanted me to ask. So hopefully we'll get to that. So anyway, welcome back to the channel. This is Peter Rogers, MD.
Okay, so the first metaphor I wanted to start with is the idea of like a video game. I think this is what health is like for all of us. You basically go through life, and to some extent, it's an obstacle course. These are like the Super Mario Brothers. And basically, when you do the stuff that you're supposed to for the game, you get energy points. It enriches your health. When you do the wrong thing, you lose energy points. And it's kind of like that for life. And I also think it reminds me of the metaphor of the last straw that broke the camel's back. In my experience, most Americans do not age well. Most Americans, in my experience, they're just getting sicker and deteriorating, but they think they're doing okay because they compare themselves to their cousin. They say things like, well, at least I'm
Mm,
not as bad as my cousin. And what
yeah.
I'm trying to say is a person should aspire to be the best they can be in terms of health and whatever else is important to them, because there's a lot of things happening in the background that are diminishing your health. And unless you make efforts to improve it, you're going to just go down the same path as most Americans. I can tell you, most of the people over 60 that I see, they're very mentally slow. They're pre-diabetic, diabetic, hypertensive, with a whole bunch of other problems. I got internal medicine friends that tell me every single one of their patients over 60 is significantly cognitively slow.
Yeah.
So here's a metaphor of the camel and the last straw that broke the camel's back. So, no matter what you do, most municipal water has F minus in it, fluoride. You can move to a place with well water, no fluoride in it. You can try to remove it with reverse osmosis, ion exchange, or distillation. Um, you can get a carbon whole house water filter for these estrogenic chemicals. There's also, they put Al in the water, aluminum, because it's a clarifier. It binds stuff to it and it makes the water look clear, even though it's another neurotoxin. Fluoride and aluminum are brain toxins. They lower
Yeah.
IQ. And that stuff's in your water. And then a lot of stuff is sweetened with high fructose corn syrup. High fructose corn syrup is often contaminated with HG, with mercury. That is a brain neurotoxin.
Oh,
Okay.
wow.
They used to sweeten baby formulas with this stuff. Okay. So they remix it in fluoridated water. It's in an aluminum can, and it's got mercury sweetener in there. And they'll often have a BPA plastic liner on the inside of the baby formula can. So these poor kids are already starting off with all this toxic stuff. The best thing for a kid is breast milk. Women should be given, in my opinion, at least 6 months time off for a baby, which they don't get. Okay, anyways, so all of this stuff adds up. So the smart move is learn about all the things that make your health worse so you can avoid them. Learn about all the things that improve your health so you can seek them out. And then you'll have the best chance of being healthy. I'm 60 years old. I don't have any medical problems. I don't take any pills. I've never had a surgery, and I don't intend to ever in my life. If you go down the path of low fat, low sodium vegan and avoid all the bad stuff, you got a good chance to live out your life healthy, like they do in the blue zones, National Geographic and Buettner and all that. Most common dietary deficiencies are lack of fiber,
Mm.
lack of potassium, magnesium, and nitrates. And it's because Americans don't eat plant foods. We're supposed to get a minimum of 50 grams a day of fiber, and preferably like 100, but the average American's only getting about 12. And then also, there's a lot of harm to our brains due to what I would call excitotoxins. So the classic excitotoxin will be like caffeine. It
Mm.
overstimulates the brain. It can cause insomnia. It
Yep.
makes the brain more active. Okay, so one cup of coffee by itself is not that big a deal, but people start superimposing things on that. They'll also eat high salt meals. The sodium is a vasoconstrictor. So now you're dropping the blood supply relative to the metabolic rate. Caffeine increases the metabolic rate. Well, guess what? Caffeine also is a vasoconstrictor, so it's lowering the oxygen and glucose delivery, the blood supply to the brain. The wider this gap gets between the metabolic rate and the blood supply, the more likely some of these neurons are just going to start dying, going into apoptosis, programmed cell death, recycle themselves. And that then goes with psychological stress. Psychological stress kind of does the same thing. It increases the metabolic rate of the neuron while diminishing the blood supply a little bit to the cerebral cortex and the hippocampus, the memory center. Sleep deprivation does the same thing. Same thing with corticosteroid medicines, because they all increase cortisol or the cortisol equivalent. So anyways, the point I want to make is it is worth your while to learn about these things and learn how to avoid them and seek out the good stuff, because most people are not doing well. You know, like when I say an old person is cognitively slow, what I mean by that is they're like a cow. Hi, yes.
Yeah, I see it all the time.
Yeah,
And you can really see it with driving these days. Driving is really bad.
yeah. So, and then there's other things that are getting you. You know, they're spraying out of these planes this stuff right here, which has got aluminum in it. You know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
It's not good. That is a brain neurotoxin. Aluminum is toxic in numerous ways. It also increases the risk of leaky gut. It increases the risk of infertility. As a matter of fact, if you asked me, what is the purpose of processed food? Well, of course, from a company's point of view, it's to make money. In order to make money, the company has to have as long a shelf life as possible, because that way it doesn't get returned to them until it sells. But if you really look at the ingredients in processed food, basically, I think it's made to sterilize people and to make them stupid.
Mm-hmm.
The really rich people that run the show on this planet, they don't like the proles, the peasants, the serfs. They think the world is overpopulated, okay?
Yep.
And they would be quite happy if you never had a child at all and if you prematurely expired, okay? Good. There'll be less pollution, less useless eaters around. I hate to say that, but I think that is how the world is run. And you say, well, how could I say that? Well, you look at the typical processed food. Where does the protein come from? It comes from soy. Well, soy is damaging to the reproductive tract. It increases infertility in both men and women. Okay, it decreases sperm counts in men. In addition, it's usually GMO soy, and who knows the significance of that? And it's usually sprayed with GP, glyphosate, glycine phosphate. Well, that's an excitotoxin. Okay, that's damaging to the brain. Okay, and then what is it sweetened with? High fructose corn syrup. So that comes from GMO corn, BT corn itself. That can cause irritation of the gut and autoimmune disease and other problems, but it's sprayed with atrazine as a herbicide that's very estrogenic. That also contributes to causing infertility, okay? F- increases infertility, okay? What else? The MSG, monosodium glutamate. Well, guess what? That's an excitotoxin, traumatic to the brain. It's harmful to the brain as an excitotoxin, but it also increases the risk of infertility, and it lowers IQ. So you got all of these things.
That's what I wanted to ask you about the last time you were on here, because MSG has been used by the Chinese for years, and obviously they don't have reproductive issues.
Well, there's differences in how it's used. And, you know, in the old days, they were reproducing okay. You know, I don't know exactly how their reproductive numbers are nowadays, but MSG is monosodium glutamate. MFG is manufacturer-free glutamate. It makes food taste better. It's a flavorant, but it's also an excitotoxin because the G stands for glutamate. And over 90% of the neurotransmitters in your brain are glutamate. Okay, basically, glutamate turns the brain on. GABA turns the brain down. And all this stuff you hear about all the time, you know, dopamine, serotonin, those are really small amounts of brain neurotransmitters, okay? You're talking just in, 1-2% minimal stuff, okay? It's really glutamate is the on switch for the brain, GABA is the off switch for the brain. And MSG activates GABA neurotransmitters when it gets into the brain. And they'll say, oh, well, it can't cross the blood-brain barrier. But that's not really true, because the blood-brain barrier has a bunch of gaps in it. It has gaps at all these chemosensor locations around the third ventricle called circumventricular organs. It has a lack of a blood-brain barrier in the vomiting center. It has a lack of blood-brain barrier in the pineal gland, lack of blood-brain barrier wherever there's damage to that lining due to stroke, due to diabetes, due to the person being young, due to the person being old from hypertension and diabetes-related atherosclerosis, from traumatic brain injury, et cetera. So it has a lot more access to the brain than is previously recognized. Plus, when the concentrations are in high amount, it can overwhelm the blood-brain barrier even when it's intact. So it's significantly worse than people think it is. And I think the purpose of MSG is it gets people addicted to a food, so they keep on buying it. And that's why the companies will always want it in there. You'll never get the companies to change because they got all the money to bribe the lobbyists. That's never going to change. So anyways, I'm also going to make the point about excitotoxins. Well, we can get into this later, but there's such a thing as mitochondrial inhibitors. In order for a cell to deal with a toxin, like a brain cell, a neuron, it has to pump out calcium, sometimes pump out a toxin. The cell needs a lot of energy. Well, there's lots of things that are mitochondrial inhibitor, including common fungal inhibitors that are put into processed food. So they prevent the brain from being able to deal with the MSG or other toxins. So it's a screw job, okay? There's also something called SERCA inhibitors, sarcoplasm, endoplasmic reticulum, calcium ATPase. And we don't need to get into all the fancy details of it, but the point of the matter is it's a calcium pump to get calcium out of the cytoplasm, to let the neurons turn off so they don't overexpend themselves and die. And what I'm basically saying is there's lots of these types of problems in processed food. Aspartame is another one that's an excitotoxin. So it's wise to do everything you can so you don't get overwhelmed, your brain cells, by this stuff, and you end up prematurely cognitively impaired. Okay, here's a normal brain cell. Here's the cell body. Here's the nucleus where the DNA is. These are the dendrites. They receive signals coming in. When the neuron decides that it's been activated, it's going to fire an action potential that'll travel down the axon, which is primarily done by sodium channels. When you reach the axon terminal, that will open up, the action potential opens up voltage-gated calcium channels. The calcium comes in. That's a key thing to know. You want to know that when calcium increases, cells are activated, because a lot of things are going to affect that. Okay, it's going to turn out that this is a really big deal for EMF, cell phones, Wi-Fi, cell towers. They open up these voltage-gated calcium channels, so they cause increased neuronal activation. You know, and again, one thing or two things by themselves, three things by themselves, our brain can handle it pretty well. But when you start throwing 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, the brain's not going to handle it as well. Okay, so when the calcium comes into the axon terminal, it activates these neurotransmitter vesicles to travel to the plasma membrane at the synaptic junction. The neurotransmitter vesicle binds, it releases neurotransmitter into the cleft. The neurotransmitter travels across to the postsynaptic neuron and exerts an effect. So glutamate's an excitatory effect. It'll increase activity in the postsynaptic neuron. That's typical neurotransmission. The most important thing for memory cognition is the hippocampus. That's the main location of our memory center. It's right in the medial temporal lobe there. This is a coronal brain, as if the person was looking at you. Okay, two big categories of atherosclerosis. This is what I call Asian atherosclerosis, based on, let's say, Japan in the 1960s and 70s. They ate tons of salt, you know, like 12 to 14 grams a day of sodium.
Yeah, I saw that.
Yeah, and they're smoking a lot of cigarettes, so they got lots of hypertension. So they'll get intracranial atherosclerosis versus typical Americans eating a real high-fat diet, and they tend to get coronary artery atherosclerosis and also carotid artery atherosclerosis. So that's sort of the Western pattern of atherosclerosis. Another really good, I think the best introductory theory for understanding dementia is what is called the Jack Delatorre theory. It's also called the chronic cerebral hypoperfusion theory. I call it the mouse equivalent theory. So Jack Delatorre was this PhD scientist working out of Texas, and he would tie off the carotid artery in a mouse. And then, what he found was about 2 months later, the mouse would become demented. So he did an autopsy on the mouse. And when he looked at the mouse's brain, he's expecting to see a big stroke, but there was no stroke. The brain was just shrunken on the side where he tied off the carotid. And the relevance is that means the neurons are going into apoptosis. So what that means is apoptosis is a slow, gradual death of a neuron. So it has time to recycle itself. If you suddenly block up a big artery in the brain and there's no collateral blood supply, so those brain cells have nothing coming in, no oxygen or glucose, they all just die. That's a stroke. You can point on an MRI. There is the stroke. And it'll be grossly abnormal at an autopsy. There's no mystery about it. But when there's just a chronic diminished amount of blood going in, enough to keep the neuron alive, but not enough for it to function normally, if that goes on a chronic amount of time, prolonged amount of time, the neuron just dies gradually. It'll recycle itself. So all of its intracellular chemicals and contents can be, eaten by a macrophage cell, immune system cell, and then sent to other locations. So you keep those basic building blocks for other cells. And that's what's the main thing that's happening. Apoptosis. Tosis means like to fall off, like the leaves fall off a tree, like a Greek word. Okay. So that's what's happening to your brain cells, all right? And then you say to yourself, well, so what? How many people have a carotid artery occlusion from atherosclerosis? And not that many. I mean, a lot of people got some stenosis, but severe stenoses and occlusions, uncommon. But you start thinking about it, this concept is super common. Lots of people have atherosclerosis in their brains, like all those Japanese people we were talking about, smoking cigarettes and being hypertensive. From eating all that salt, that the high pulse pressure from a high blood pressure, it damages the artery. It's like hitting away at it like a water pick. The artery tries to protect itself, and it lays down fibrosis, collagen tissue to thicken itself. And that thickening decreases the ability of the small arteries, capillaries to deliver oxygen to the tissue. And it leads to the equivalent of chronic cerebral hypoperfusion. Also, if you look at the drug companies, they want money. Okay. And the way they get money is they kind of control the universities. if you got some doc working at a big name university, Ivy League or something, and he wants money, grant money from big pharma, if he writes a paper, big pharma will give him money to say, gee, you know, we probably, instead of treating hypertension when the systolic pressure is 150, let's treat it 140. You know what? How about let's treat it 130? How about let's treat whenever it goes over 125? The reason I say that is the lower they can make the threshold for when to treat with medications, hypertension, the more drugs they sell. So the pressure is always, oh, I think we got to lower that threshold a little, lower it a little bit, you know, get millions more patients. So, the doc from the big university that kisses butt to big pharma, they'll give him more grant money. You know, he'll be encouraged to be promoted. He's bringing in big money to the university. Everybody's happy. Isn't it wonderful? But what I'm saying is they could never disagree with big pharma, because if they disagree with big pharma, no more funding for this guy. They really piss off big pharma. Big pharma will contact that university, say, fire him. This guy's trouble. He's no good. Fire him. Okay. Discredit his research, ruin his career. All right. So that's why all the big name medical centers all kiss butt to big pharma. So they get their research money and their grant money. And that's why also nothing can change in the way the system is. It can never change. And that's why the individual should try to learn about it so they protect themselves from the nonsense. All right. And what I'm getting at, there's a risk of over-treating hypertension. If you over-treat, use too much medication, you'll drop the pressure too low. Well, guess what? You're like the mouse. That's why I call it mouse equivalence. Over-treated hypertension, mouse equivalent. All right. Congestive heart failure. You don't got a good heart. It's not pumping well because of chronic atherosclerosis. And for other reasons, you don't get enough blood to the brain. You're like the mouse. Okay. Atrial fibrillation, a very common thing, largely due to atherosclerosis causing ischemia of the heart, lack of blood supply to the heart muscles, so they weaken and the conduction pathways become abnormal in the atrium. But the point is, then you lose atrial filling. So you decrease the amount of blood pumped to the brain. You're like the mouse. All right. You can send a patient for open heart surgery for coronary artery disease, which is kind of stupid, actually, because you can usually get a better result from a low-fat vegan diet like the Esselstyn data. But the reason I tell you this, it was many years ago, like 25 years ago, my father went for open heart surgery. I didn't know enough at that time to talk him out of it. And I slept, in his room in the ICU post-operative, and the anesthesiologist run his pressure really low, something like 90 over 60. And I'm like, why are you running his pressure so low? I called the anesthesiologist over there, and he's like, well, we don't want to bleed. We don't want him to bleed at the anastomoses, the plug-in sites of the grafts for the open heart surgery, the coronary artery bypass.
Yeah.
And I'm like, well, that's pretty low. I worry about his brain. Luckily, my dad was healthier than the usual patient for open heart surgery, and he came out of it fine. But a lot of patients have a drop in cognitive function after open heart surgery for that reason.
Oh, wow.
They're like the mouse. They're being run chronically hypotensive. And by the way, I think that the cardiology treatment of coronary artery disease is kind of a big joke. People say, well, how could you say that? Cardiology is a very prestigious fellowship, a specialty. Yeah, right. What is the cure rate for treating coronary artery disease, atherosclerosis of the heart arteries with pills? It's 0%. The patient's never cured. They take the pills the rest of their life, statins and all that sort of stuff. What is the cure rate if you place a stent in the coronary artery? It's 0%.
Wow.
You never cure them, because what you can do is you can stent open a narrowing in one of the epicardial coronaries. The epicardial coronaries are the coronary arteries on top of the heart. They're the big ones on the outside of the heart. But here's the problem. There was a cardiologist by the name of William Roberts. He's the most famous cardiac pathologist in the whole world. He wrote a paper, 2,000 autopsies on, patients that died from coronary artery disease. And what he found was it's always diffuse. It's a systemic process that's occurring everywhere in the arterial system. All right. And what that means is they used to say, well, this patient has single vessel coronary artery disease. We're just going to stent this artery, the left anterior descending. We're just going to bypass this artery. But that's all nonsense. He says it's never isolated to one artery. Never. It's always diffuse. And not only do you have the epicardial coronaries that you could see, so let's say this was an epicardial coronary on the heart. There's a whole bunch of perforating. There's tons of them, little tiny perforating branches that go into the myocardium, into the muscle. They're too small. You could never stent those. You could never bypass those. And lots of people have atherosclerosis and clot inside of those small vessels. The only thing you can do is try to keep your blood on the thin side by minimizing dietary fat and by avoiding things that cause vasoconstriction, sodium and caffeine and whatnot. Okay. And you also want to avoid this leaky gut. There's a whole bunch of literature on the concept of leaky gut causing bacterial endotoxins, LPS, lipopolysaccharide, to get into the blood, and that causing abnormal blood clotting. They cause something that's called amyloid blood clotting. Amyloid blood clotting. Amyloid means that a protein that normally has what's called an alpha helix structure, like a cylinder, be changed into a beta pleated sheet. If you look in a biochemistry book, there's going to be, two basic types of secondary protein structures: cylindrical, alpha helix, or flat, beta pleated sheet. So it changes from cylindrical to beta pleated sheet, and it'll stack up and it'll tend to precipitate out a solution. The relevance is that these clots, because it's causing an amyloid transformation of fibrinogen, the clotting protein. And what that means is these clots are refractory. They're resistant to being dissolved by the thinners, the blood thinners that are moving around in your blood. Okay, you got things like tissue plasminogen activator and whatnot that dissolve the clots. And normally there's always some type of steady state clot formation, clot dissolution. But what I'm saying is with infections, either bacterial or viral, and with leaky gut, you have a tendency to form more and more of these little amyloid clots, and they can go around plugging things up in your heart, plugging things up in your brain. So you don't want to be eating fat all day, which makes your red blood cells stick together. And on top of that, being stressed out, which increases fibrinogen, makes red blood cells stick together, and eating a lot of vasoconstrictors, salt and caffeine, causing your vessels to be narrowed. A narrow vessel is more prone to occlusion by thrombosis. So I would say it's good to be aware of that because not many people know about it. And if you look it up, you can look it up under amyloid blood clots. It'll sometimes be called fibrinoid blood clots, amyloidogenic blood clots. And the two real famous researchers for working on this one is a guy by the name of Douglas Kell from England. And the other one, PhD, and the other one is Etheresia praetorius, just like South Africa. I think that's a city or a province.
Yeah.
And they both together did all this research. And I think it's a very useful concept to get. Okay, so that was kind of the point with the mouse equivalent.
Now, how much fat is too much fat? I don't want to forget to ask you that before the end of this, because I know that was a question that people have.
Yeah, I don't usually count it or measure, but here's what I would say. There's this whole big slogan about good fats, got to get your good fats. I personally think that's all BS. I don't think there are any good fats. And I'll tell you why I say that. Excuse me. If you go back to some of the old school research, a guy by the name of Nathan Pritikin was a genius, and he reviewed all the literature on dietary fat. And here's the conclusion he came to: fat is bad. And you say, well, how could you say that? What do you mean? Isn't that an oversimplification? And here's why he would say that. First of all, there's studies showing that you can take populations and feed them less than 1% fat, 0.75% fat, and they do very well on that. Okay. He reviewed all these studies in some of his books. I read all of his books. Okay, then what are some of the other things that come out of this? No matter what fat you eat, all fat is very high nutrient. It's very high in caloric density, so it predisposes you to gain weight. If you talk about saturated fat, there's tons of problems with saturated fat. You talk about trans fat, tons of problems with trans fat. And then people say, well, what about MUFA, monounsaturated fatty acid? Olive oil, isn't olive oil good? No, olive oil is not good for you. It also makes you fat. And it might be, in the ballpark of 70% MUFA, but it's also usually in the ballpark 10 to 14% saturated fat. And then it has a lot of PUFA, polyunsaturated fat as well. And that's often omega-6, so-called inflammatory fats. There are a lot of problems with omega-6s. They're very atherogenic, and they also cause a whole bunch of other problems as well. And then people say, well, you can't say anything bad about omega-3s. We know omega-3s are good. We've heard people say omega-3s are good. We've heard people say they're protective of the brain. And I'm going to tell you, I think that's wrong. Okay, now why do I say that? First of all, what do you have to do? You have to, theoretically, they're to keep fish from freezing in Antarctica where the water is about freezing temperature. Okay.
Yeah.
But all right, if you talk about them for humans, theoretical benefit, they might fluidize a plasma membrane, and theoretically that might speed up the rate of neuronal conduction. By the way, do you know why women have big butts? Women have big butts because they store some of their omega-3 fats down there for the baby, because the baby actually does need some omega-3 fats to help build its brain and its eyes and to speed neuronal conduction in its brain and its eyes. So there is some truth that omega-3s are useful for that. However, and so the reason she carries them on her butt and her upper thighs is that's energetically efficient. Our ancestors, they worried about starving to death every day. Where are we going to get some food? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So that's also, I think, why women have small shoulders. A woman has to be strong enough to control her son until he hits puberty. He can go off with the men and do whatever the men do in their community. Okay.
Yeah.
But she doesn't need to be heavier than that. Okay. And so, and I remember that because I was in 6th grade and I won a wrestling tournament. I was all happy. I was acting kind of cocky around the house. I pissed off my mother And my mother was a pretty athletic lady. She picked me up and she, threw me on the bed, whipped me with the belt or something. I'm like, wow, my mom could kick my ass, And I remembered that. And then I got a lot bigger by next year, by 7th grade, and there was no comparison. I was so much stronger than her. But I just remember that being kind of shocked by my mother doing that to me. And that's about where it is for most mothers relative to their sons. They can control him till he hits puberty. So anyways, they don't need big shoulders, because if the woman had bigger shoulders and was heavy, then she'd be more at risk to starve to death and not be able to carry a pregnancy to term. So anyways, getting off of that, getting back to the omega-3s, they are anti-inflammatory to some extent, which theoretically might be good, but that also means that they can cause immune suppression. No. And there are concerns, like in animal studies, it'll increase the risk of liver cancer metastases. And then if you also put them in human studies, they increase the risk of prostate cancer. And my thought is anything that increases prostate cancer in a man, the prostate is sort of like the male equivalent of the female uterus.
Yeah.
And it's related, it tends to be estrogenic sensitive, if you will. So it probably will increase the risk of breast cancer. I don't know that for sure, but I would expect that to probably be the case. It's going to make you fatter. It's an obesogen with all that high caloric density. Plus, they typically say keep it in an opaque container and store it in the fridge, because otherwise it's going to undergo lipid peroxidation. It means go rancid. Well, as soon as you put that in your body, this supplement created thing that you don't even know if it's really what it says it is, it's going to pretty rapidly undergo lipid peroxidation, I would think. The more double bonds in the PUFA, the more likely it undergoes lipid peroxidation. And the ones that they sell, like in fish oil and stuff, the DHA and EPA, they've got lots of them. They got more double bonds than anything. They'd be the most likely one to rapidly undergo lipid peroxidation. You're putting that in your 98.6 degree mouth, and I think you got a pretty high risk. Plus, they say, well, what is the need for omega-3s? You know what? All of us can still remember our childhood. Why? Because our brain cells don't turn over that much. We're not talking about gut stem cells that are constantly turning over. Our brain cells have been there since we were, 2 years old, okay? So we don't have that much turnover in the brain to need so much. And there are omega-3 precursors in the plant foods that we eat. So I think it's a non-issue. I think it's just an exaggerated, talked up thing. Any commercial food that's profitable gets all these bogus studies funded by industry to promote the product, okay? Yeah. And a lot of the nutrition experts, you look around this internet, you're going to have all these nutrition experts saying, well, you need omega-3s to prevent dementia. Yeah, right. And then you notice that they're selling it, okay? I don't buy it. I'll just let you know. I look at brains all the time. What do I see all day long, every day? Hypertension, diabetes, 1 or 2 cataract surgeries, and poor dentition all day long. Hypertension and diabetes, they are totally, strongly associated with dementia. And as a matter of fact, they're so common in Americans. Like if you said to me, 65-year-old American male, I would automatically expect him to be diabetic and hypertensive. I would just expect it because it's so common. This is a little more of what I was talking about. Now I'm going to talk about my own theory of dementia. I'll actually get to it in a moment here. But just remember that antioxidants kind of protect you. Where do they come from? They come from plants, okay? Stimulants get you in trouble from overacting that metabolic rate in the neuron. And then you better be able to deliver the ATP, the energy production necessary to detoxify them. Because if you can't, your neurons will start dying. Okay, I'll just mention here briefly a normal variant in the brain. One of my things I do, by the way, is I'm a neuroradiologist is one of my fields. I was also trained in endovascular interventional radiology. Okay, so here's the brain. We're looking at the circle of Willis. These are the blood vessels in the bottom of the brain. These are the posterior communicating arteries. And normally they sort of regress in an adult, but in some people they don't regress and they're big. And when they stay big, what ends up happening is the basilar artery, which feeds the posterior fossa, the brainstem, the cerebellum, it will be hypoplastic. It'll be really small. And that's relevant because it sits right here on the brainstem. And when this artery is real small, small diameter arteries are more prone to getting sort of crud, if you will, along their sides, atherosclerosis. And they've got a whole bunch of little penetrating arteries that go into the brainstem. And what I'm saying is any one of us, at this meeting right now could have atherosclerosis in our basilar artery, and that means we're at increased risk for a stroke of the pons, the brainstem, or of the cerebellum. And I'll just give you a typical example of it. Here's a brain MRI, and all these little white spots are strokes. Pop, pop, pop.
Oh, wow.
Pop, 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 pop. And I see at least one of these persistent fetals, hypoplastic basilars every day. None of us know if we have it or not. So the smart move is just assume you got it and live your life from a health perspective accordingly. Minimize your risk factors because you don't know what you're predisposed to. Okay, this is just sort of normal arteries, relatively wide open, and here are atherosclerotic arteries where there's, accumulation of atherosclerotic plaque. And what I'm also going to basically tell you is I think Alzheimer's is a bit of a joke. I'll explain why I call Alzheimer's a joke in just a moment. Okay, one thing we'll talk about is blood pressure, the Goldilocks balance. You want your blood pressure not too high, not too low, just right. And if you eat a low-fat, low-sodium vegan diet, it'll tend to do that on its own if you still have healthy arteries. Excuse me, as a person gets older, they have already damaged their arteries if they've been hypertensive for a couple of decades. So they might never get a fully, totally normal blood pressure, but they can often still control it with diet or maybe only need one medicine instead of 3 or 4. Okay, here is the carotid artery going up into the brain, and then it bifurcates at this point. There'll be an anterior cerebral artery not drawn in here, and a middle cerebral artery going laterally, comes up over the convexities of the brain. These little arteries going into the basal ganglia, like the lenticular striates, they're typically called. These arteries can get sheared off by severe hypertension, and a person can have a little bleed in this area. They often get what's called a lacunar infarct, stroke, and that means a little hole. Lacunar means hole in the brain. But by far, the most common type of stroke I see by a factor of 100 is right in this area. That's why I drew the skull and crossbones in there. These are the ventricles contain cerebral spinal fluid. So these are this is the periventricular area. Okay, periventricular deep white matter. And the reason why this strokes so often is it's sort of an end artery territory. These little arteries coming up, penetrating arteries coming up, penetrating arteries going down. And quite often, there's just not enough blood supply to get there. The hardest thing to get blood flow to is the top of your brain.
Yeah.
And that's why we have a blood pressure. So that's why I'm a little nervous about somebody who says, oh, we got to really lower this blood pressure rapidly. Are you sure you want to do that? Because you got to get blood to that brain. All right. So here is, I had a little problem with the slide here, but here is the brain where this is what I see all day, every day. This would be like a typical 75-year-old brain. So here's the cerebral spinal fluid in the lateral ventricles are called, and all these white spots are strokes.
Oh my God.
Yeah, so the stuff touching the ventricles is called juxtaventricular. The stuff near it, but not touching, is periventricular. The stuff out by the cortex. Cortex means like bark of a tree. So the cortical ribbon like traces the outline of the brain. Those would be subcortical. So the MRI brain dictation for this would be extensive juxtaventricular, periventricular, subcortical flare hyperintensities, most likely due to small vessel cerebral atherosclerotic disease, meaning diabetes and hypertension. Those are the main risk factors for stroke. If you ask neurologists, they'll say diabetes is the most common cause of stroke. Hypertension is the most common cause of stroke. Atrial fibrillation is the most common cause of stroke. How could all three be the most common? And the reason is, in terms of garden variety, stuff like this, it's going to be hypertension. In terms of big strokes, a big embolus being tossed up from the heart to the brain, that's going to be AFib. And then diabetes just tends to be a bit of this sort of an insidious progressive decline in cognitive function, not necessarily as much these strokes. But diabetes also makes the blood more prothrombotic. The same things that cause diabetes tend to cause hypertension. They go together. Most patients who have one have the other, or if they're hypertensive first, they're pre-diabetic. They probably have a fatty liver. A fatty liver is so common, the majority of Americans have it over 50, that if you have an ultrasound requisition and it says elevated LFT, liver function test, you don't even need to look at the films. I can tell you 99% of the time that patient will have a fatty liver. It's common in the United States.
What do you do about it?
Well, the thing to do is eat a low-fat, low-sodium vegan diet. And don't drink alcohol, that predisposes to it. And don't drink, fructose sweetened beverages, that predisposes to fatty liver as well. And also, I would say don't eat that, glyphosate sprayed non-organic, soy or other food sprayed with that GP. It's not just sprayed on soy. It's also used, to get the leaves to fall off before harvest for non-organic beans, wheat, oats. It's sprayed on a surprisingly large number of things. That's why I think organic is a good thing, because even though it's not perfect, it protects you from glyphosate being sprayed on stuff, and also from atrazine being sprayed on stuff. Yeah, so here's a normal capillary in the brain. The red blood cells are a little bit bigger than the capillary. They're about 7 microns in diameter. Capillary is usually about 5 microns in diameter. So the red blood cell has to fold back on itself a little bit as it passes through the capillary. These are the endothelial cells in the background, spindle shape. There's a nucleus. The yellow is the basement membrane of the capillary. The green are the vascular smooth muscles, okay? And as the red blood cells travel through, These blue circles are the oxygen that they release, and that oxygen goes down to the neuron here, and that enables it to make energy and function. Okay, with time, diabetes will cause thickening of the capillary basement membrane. And then the hypertension will cause hypertrophy of the vascular smooth muscle. And there'll also be collagen, fibrotic tissue, fibrosis, scar tissue that's laid down along the wall of the artery to protect it from the high blood pressure. And the relevance is when you make this arterial wall thicker, capillary wall thicker, it's harder for these red blood cells to deliver oxygen to the neuron. So you're causing less oxygen to be delivered to that neuron. And as people get older, they got multiple things working against them. Their endothelial cells make a little bit less nitric oxide. Their walls of their arteries and capillaries are often thickened by hypertension and diabetes. And then you start superimposing upon that, I'll have this caffeine, vasoconstriction in your brain, increasing the metabolic activity, etc. You can see how you're having a recipe for what I call neurovascular uncoupling. The metabolic rate going up, 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 but the oxygen and glucose delivery in terms of the blood flow going down, 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 that neuron's screwed. You're going to head into apoptosis. Okay, this is a little bit about, let's see, do we need to cover anything on this one? Well, we'll skip that slide. We'll skip this one because it didn't show. Okay, but this is a good slide here. This is how a typical brain cell functions. You've got a plasma membrane, that means outer membrane of the cell, pump that pumps out 3 sodiums, okay, while it pumps in a couple of potassiums. The net result is it's pumping out 3 positive charges, taking in 2, that you accumulate a positive charge outside the cell, and you also have a concentration gradient of sodium. It's 10 times higher here, 140 over inside the cell. It should be 14 inside. And the relevance is sodium really wants to get into the cell because it has a positive charge, Na+. Inside of the cell is negatively charged, about negative 65 millivolts approximately. And it also has a concentration gradient. The ions want to equilibrate their concentration gradient. So what that means is you can let sodium come into the cell and use that like a water wheel on a mill to generate energy to do other useful work. And the big thing is to pump calcium out. Calcium is the big deal in terms of ions. Calcium is an on switch. When calcium comes into the cell, the cell is turned on and does whatever that cell does. And so when the cell wants to turn itself off, it has to quickly pump calcium away. It pumps calcium out of the cell using this thing called a NACA exchanger. Na for natrium, that means sodium in Latin. Ca for calcium. Okay, X is just for exchanger. So it's often abbreviated NCX. And that gets the calcium out of the cytoplasm real fast. Okay, you've also got this thing here called the circa. It's really the endoplasmic reticulum in a neuron. The word sarcoplasm is sort of a holdover from what it does in muscles. But the point is, this is a reservoir to store calcium. So when you want to lower the cytoplasm calcium, you can pump it into the endoplasmic reticulum here. And it's called the circa pump. That actually ends up being important. And here's the PMCA, the plasma membrane calcium ATPase. This also pumps calcium out of the cell. So calcium comes up, typical neurotransmitter is released, and typical neuron and other cells, whatever they do it when calcium comes up. And in a muscle cell, it contracts, okay? And this is basically how a cell carries out its business. About 2/3 of the energy in a neuron goes to this pump because it's so important to establish these gradients, because it's like having a battery for energy. It's like electrical energy for a cell. And that's how a cell gets its work done. Okay, so when a cell wants to turn off, like I was saying, it'll pump calcium into the endoplasmic reticulum. It'll pump through the PMCA out of the cell, or it'll pump through the NACA exchanger to get that calcium out of the cytoplasm so it can turn off. The cell cannot allow itself to be constantly turned on when it doesn't need to be, because otherwise it will not have the energy to pump out this calcium. And when you get too high a level of calcium, the cell just dies. So everything has to be tightly regulated. Here's what glutamate does. Glutamate binds to these receptors on the plasma membrane of a neuron. It'll first bind to something called the AMPA receptor that lets in sodium, and that depolarizes the cell. It lowers the negativity of that charge. And the point is that activates what's called the NMDA receptor, and now calcium floods into the cell. And there's a couple other ways calcium gets in there, but the important point is when glutamate binds, calcium goes up, cell's activated. This is just a little more detail about the same thing. All right, and then here's showing what happens. The glutamate then, like we talked about earlier, the glutamate in neurotransmitter vesicles travel to the plasma membrane at the synaptic cleft. Glutamate is released. It diffuses across to the postsynaptic neuron, activates these glutamate receptors, and the net result is they activate the postsynaptic neuron. Now, if you've got too much glutamate in here because you're flooding the cell with MSG, with MFG, you're stressed out, sleep deprived, drinking too much caffeine, taking corticosteroid medicines, you can get too much glutamate activating this postsynaptic neuron. And then calcium goes too high. When calcium goes too high, you can activate this enzyme called calpain, which is a great name. Cal for calcium, pain for painful consequences. And when calpain is activated, it just starts damaging things in the postsynaptic neuron, and it can very easily cause the postsynaptic neuron to die. It'll deactivate NCX. So it just creates a vicious cycle, and the neuron spirals down and dies. So you don't want that. Okay, little things about how to avoid these problems. You just eat P for plants, P for potassium. It's a vasodilator. When you eat more potassium, your body excretes the sodium, and it's the opposite is true also. When you eat a lot of dietary sodium, you will excrete your kidneys, you'll piss out a lot of potassium. And the reason is the body has to carefully regulate all of our ions, and they're both positively charged. Potassium is abbreviation is K for kalium, the Latin for potassium, and it also is 1+. And you have like a seesaw, a sodium and potassium. Our ancestors probably ate about 25 times more potassium than sodium, whereas we do the opposite. We eat about 10, 15 times more sodium than potassium. So we are screwing up our physiology. And the reason is there's tons of salt put into processed food because it tastes good and it's a preservative. Same thing with meat. It's often used as a preservative in meat and also a flavor, and it tastes good. So people eating the typical Western diet with lots of processed food and meat, they're eating really high sodium. And then potassium comes from plants. Most Americans don't eat hardly any plants, and that makes them, predisposed to hypertension. Magnesium, I'm sorry.
When you say plants, what do you mean by plants? Like
pretty much any plant. If a good thing to do is take a look at the labels on the food, the nutrient labels, and look at how much potassium and how much sodium. If the potassium is 10 times or more higher than the sodium, that's a relatively naturally occurring food. But, and Burkett said there is, he was an Irish Christian missionary to Africa. He said there's no animal on the whole planet that eats more sodium than potassium, except for humans with this modern diet stuff. And you'll look at a lot of plant foods, they'll have like literally 500 times more potassium than sodium. Okay. And our kidneys are designed to piss out extra potassium. We're actually designed primarily to conserve the sodium because it was a little bit sparse in the wilderness, and that's why, animals like to lick salt. I think that's why we kind of seek it out and have a taste for it, because it used to be kind of a relatively sparse thing to get our hands on, if you will. So anyways, we went from being 25-to-1 potassium to sodium to being about 10, 15-to-1 sodium to potassium. And that has negative consequences for all of our health. High blood pressure. It also screws up our plasma membrane ion gradients in our cells. Let's see. All right. Here's another way that diabetes makes people stupid. I actually meant to show some other slides about insulin resistance first, but insulin resistance used to be thought something of just the body. We usually, when you say the body versus the brain, what you mean is the brain is what's in your skull. Your central nervous system is your brain and your spinal cord, and they're all protected from the rest of the body by having a blood-brain barrier. And it used to be thought that glucose just takes care of itself in the brain and the spinal cord, and insulin resistance of diabetes only matters for, from the part of the body outside the brain and the spinal cord. But that's actually not true. All the old books in medicine, they're basically all wrong. You've got glucose type 1 transporters, the blood-brain barrier. You got glucose type 3 transporters in your neurons. But what is not known, what's wrong in all the books, is that you got glucose type 4 transporters in your neurons, okay? And these are the same type that are in your skeletal muscles. A glucose type 1 transporter and type 3, they're in the membrane, they're always active. But a glucose type 4 transporter is only active when insulin binds to a receptor on the cell and it sends a signal, hey, go to the plasma membrane. So when they go to the plasma membrane, they will form channels and they'll allow the glucose to come into the cell. So the brain has to be able to quickly ramp itself up. You're walking through, what is the purpose of a brain? To walk down a path in a forest, a jungle, or prairie, or to survive, okay? Yeah. So, things happen out in the woods. There's a bunch of coyotes. I got to run for my life. Should I fight? Should I climb a tree? What should I do? All right, so what I'm saying is you suddenly have to dramatically increase the amount of energy expenditure in your muscles and in your brain. And the brain has a way to do that. What happens is the endoplasmic reticulum, remember, it's a calcium reservoir, we call it the circa, but the S part's really for muscle. Okay, so anyways, it will send calcium into the mitochondria. And when the calcium enters the mitochondria, these are called MAMs, and it means mitochondria-associated membranes. It'll send calcium into the matrix of the mitochondria, and that will cause upregulation, meaning an increase in the activity level and the number of your Krebs cycle enzymes. Okay, and these produce the precursors that are going to go to electron transport on the inner mitochondrial membrane to make lots of ATP. You can make tons more ATP with oxygen in the mitochondria than you can in the cytoplasm with just glycolysis. All right, but here's the point. Normally, our ancestors, they never had that much insulin resistance. Okay, so what this means is because of the insulin resistance, this glucose insulin signal is not getting sent to the GLUT4 transporters. And this red line is to indicate, like a stoplight blockage. And this glucose here with the arrows showing bouncing off the neuron. It can't get in adequate amounts. And the endoplasmic reticulum doesn't seem to recognize well that not enough glucose is coming into the cell. And it says, hey, come on, we got to move. Coyotes in the woods. Let's go, let's go, let's go. Puts this calcium into the neuron, but it can't get the energy precursors. And you get too much calcium in the mitochondrial matrix, the mitochondria just dies. Okay.
Wow.
So you put these neurons at high risk for apoptosis and going into cell death. And so this is another reason why diabetics have very poor cognitive function. If you ask, my experience, like what patients tend to have the worst cognitive function, the absolute worst are dialysis patients with kidney failure. They're like a disaster. I mean, it's rare to meet a dialysis patient that has a triple-digit IQ. Okay. They're just really, really slow. Next worst after that would be sleep apnea patients. They're falling asleep when they're talking to you. They'll have a hard time remembering their sentence. They have a lot of cognitive impairment problems. And they also, because their brains at night are often quite hypoglycemic. And plus they're falling asleep. They're tired. So it's hard for them to maintain their attention. Okay, but then the third group of patients that are very functioning very poorly from a cognitive point of view are these diabetics. It's very routine. I'll be talking to a diabetic. Let's say I'm talking to a 60-year-old diabetic, and he just had his foot amputated. And I'm trying to be nice about it because I know he doesn't know anything about nutrition. I know the people taking care of him probably don't know anything about nutrition. And I'll say, you might want to try to improve your diet. You know? And the guy's like, oh, at my age, what are you going to do? I'm like, well, you better do something.
Yeah.
Lose your other foot. And not only are you going to lose your other foot, the next amputation is going to be right below the knee. That's called a BKA, below knee amputation. And the next one after that's going to be it's going to be up in the upper thigh. Okay. So they don't seem to get it. The typical diabetic you talk to, they go, I'm doing okay. It's under control. It's under control. I'm taking my pills. It's under control. No, it's not under control.
Yeah.
You really need to get your diet together. Otherwise, you're pretty much screwed. This is the inner mitochondrial membrane. So here's the outer mitochondrial membrane. The space in between the outer and the inner membrane is called the IMS, intramembranous space. The inner mitochondrial membrane. And the reason this matters, like why am I showing you this? Because this is where your energy comes from. This is where life comes from. This inner mitochondrial membrane, it's super important. IMM's use abbreviation for inner mitochondrial membrane. It's got the highest gradient of anything in the body, negative 160 millivolts, off the charts. And this is like your electrical power plant for your individual cells.
Yeah.
And initially, these are the complexes, 1, 2, 3, 4, and they hand off electrons. It's like a snowball rolling down the hill, or like a fireman bucket brigade. You take this electron, you take this one, take this one, take this one. And then oxygen is the ultimate electron acceptor, and then it gets converted into water. And that's because oxygen has a super powerful electronegativity, meaning it wants to grab electrons. And so the energy of transferring electrons to progressively more aggressive grabbers of electrons, if you will, is that it's coupled to pumping protons. H plus is a proton, comes from hydrogen. Basically, the cell is a genius, okay? The biology of the human body is super, super genius. It's so incredible. It's like beyond belief. And that's also why I believe in God, because this is way, way, way too complicated to happen by accident. If you get like the smartest human in the world who devotes their entire life for 50 years to studying one thing, they can figure out one little tiny piece of it, okay? That's how much stuff is going on and how beyond humans it all is. Okay, so anyways, the electrons are passed down and protons are pumped out. And now you've built up a gradient. It's almost like pressurized air. Then, if you will, at the end here, this is complex 5. Sometimes it's called ATP synthase. It allows a proton to come back into the mitochondrial matrix. The center of the mitochondria is the matrix. And when that comes in, like spinning a mill wheel with water, like a water wheel, that then couples this phosphate to this ADP, adenosine diphosphate, to become adenosine triphosphate. An ATP molecule is like a $20 bill in a cell. That is the unit of work to get things done, ATP. And the mitochondria makes like over 80% of the ATP in your cell. That's where your energy comes from, because your mitochondria is making it with the help of oxygen. And what I meant by split the atom, it splits the hydrogen into a proton and into an electron. The electrons are passed down this way. The protons are pumped into here. And then the protons taken back into the cell. It's rejoined. Part of it, in a sense, is rejoined over here to make water when you add that to the oxygen. But I'm just telling you, it's like incredible how great this is. Okay, and you're going to hear about mitochondria all the time. Mitochondria are right foundational to tons of understanding about disease and about aging. So what I just showed you is about, you don't need to know much more than that, but you should know what I just showed you. That's worth knowing. I guarantee that comes up all the time. Okay, here's just showing another cell. This time I got it written out a little more information. So here's the extracellular concentration of sodium, 140, 10 times higher than the intracellular concentration of 14. And that's a chemical gradient. And the fact that you have a negative charge on the inside of the cell relative to the outside, that's electrical gradient. So together, this electrochemical gradient, and that is what powers the ability of the cell to do work. Like I said, take in 3 sodiums, and that gives you the energy to push out a potassium. And you need a lot of energy. It always takes energy to push out potassium. I'm sorry, to push out calcium. This is a calcium, because calcium concentration outside the cell is super high. So the fact that you always need energy to pump calcium anywhere, what that means is you need ATP. And what that means is you need a functional mitochondria. So what I'm trying to say is these things are connected. You can't inhibit the mitochondria without causing a problem somewhere else. And this slide, I think, is interesting. This is a mitochondria, and I've drawn all these inhibitors of mitochondria. And where this comes from was, I had been studying this stuff, really interested in understanding it. And I'm like, gee, I got to look up mitochondrial inhibitors. I don't remember learning anything about mitochondrial inhibitors, but they've got to be important, because that's how we make energy. And I hear all these things about mitochondrial damage. So I'm like, let me start looking up. So I went through all my old biochemistry books, and I used to really like biochemistry. I go through my college biochemistry, my med school biochemistry, and I'm like, nothing about mitochondrial inhibition. Nothing. Like, it doesn't exist.
Wow.
I'm like, that can't be true. There's a lot of things that must inhibit mitochondria. I knew there were, because I'd heard hints of it in different papers. So let me start going through the papers. I start looking up mitochondrial inhibitors, papers on mitochondrial inhibitors. There's over 50 of them, okay? And lots of them are very common. Tell me if you've heard of this before. Statin medications. Metformin. You ever heard of that?
Yeah.
Tylenol, atrazine, fluoride, okay? Omega-6 oils, their lipid peroxidation product, hydroxynonenal, toxic aldehyde from that. Any type of hypoxia, which is hypertension and diabetes, causing vascular disease leading to hypoxia, lack of oxygen delivery to the tissue. Okay, welders can get it from manganese and some other mining chemicals. Okay, antifungals, the preservatives in all this processed food. Okay, titanium dioxide nanoparticles, they can also be in a lot of things. They're whiteners, and they can do other things for processing. Okay, TCE, trichloroethylene, that's used in dry cleaning. That's why I don't take my clothes to dry clean anymore. I don't care. Is my shirt a little wrinkled? I could give a rat's tail, okay? Do I got a little ring around the collar? I could give a rat's tail, okay? I'm an old married guy. Nobody cares about me anyways. I'm not going to waste my time or money worrying about that. But anyways, the other thing people don't know about, a lot of psychiatric medicines are mitochondria inhibitors. Like here's Haldol, the typical antipsychotic for treatment of schizophrenic or acute psychotic episodes, okay? And it ain't just Haldol. A lot of the other ones too. Sertraline, that's an SSRI, serotonin selective reuptake inhibitor. And there's other SSRIs there. This is the same type of problem. So I think those psych meds are very, very overrated. That's a topic for another day. That's a whole big topic, but I'm just letting you know that is an issue. And then remember, we talked about these estrogenic chemicals, BPA, bisphenol A. Here's what's interesting about estrogenic chemicals. We know that estrogen is an obesogen, makes people get fat. It's sort of like they go up in pregnancy to help the woman store more fat. They want to lower her metabolic rate in a sense, so she'll have that fat as energy that the baby might potentially need. But they're not good for the brain, okay? And so what I'm trying to say here is they've gone through these estrogenic chemicals, and they found out the vast majority of them, they're neurotoxic. So not only do they make you fat, they also make you stupid. And they're mitochondrial inhibitors, a lot of them, like BPA. They're bad. We talk about how the companies say, well, BPA has now been banned, BPA-free plastic. But that's nonsense, because they just put an S in the center, some type of sulfur group, and it still has the phenol groups at the outer parts, meaning that it still interacts with the estrogen receptor. So it really does you no benefit.
It's virtually impossible, though, to get away from BPA.
Well, the companies are always going to do what's best for them from a profit point of view. They're always going to pay off, their lobbyists to just get the rules made so they can continue. What I'm trying to say is don't ever think a company or any institution is ever going to do anything to help you. They never will, unless it's profitable for them. So that's why, it's worth your while to learn how to protect yourself. And be skeptical. Be skeptical of most things you hear. Most of what you hear when somebody says this is science, it's just advertising, Like I said, for caffeine, there's all this positive publicity for caffeine, for coffee and tea. I'll tell you something, I think it's all BS. I don't drink coffee or tea for those reasons.
No,
I used to for about 15 years, but then once I started reading all this stuff, I'm like, holy crap, this is a mistake. I'm not doing that anymore. Okay, so I just wanted to make this point. All the stuff in the biochemistry textbooks that are taught to, doctors, so to speak, okay? They don't include any useful information. Doctors don't know anything about nutrition. They don't know anything about toxicology. And that's why it's kind of a joke. The most important thing for health is nutrition and toxicology. And it is not taught to doctors. And that's why somebody on their own could just study for a month and they will know more relevant information about healthy aging and preventing all the common chronic diseases, diabetes, hypertension, coronary artery disease, et cetera, which means also impotence, blindness, et cetera, stroke, dementia, et cetera. So I think that's actually kind of funny. I mean, I was a little pissed off. I was in my mid-30s. I had gotten overweight. My father was going for open heart surgery, and my mother had cancer. And I'm like, what the hell? I thought I was a good doctor. How come I'm sick and my parents are sick? What's going on? Maybe conventional medicine can't do anything. And so I started searching all over the place. And actually, I had one of my relatives make fun of me. I was kind of fat at that time. And she's like, if you know so much about nutrition, Mr. Doctor, why are you so fat? And I'm like, well, I'm working on it, okay? And once I started going through all the literature, I'm like, holy crap. This is all the valuable information. Almost all of it's in the nutrition and toxicology literature. And I realized, how do you become skinny? You look at the people who are skinny and you copy them, okay? China before 1970 eating rice, 1 billion out of 1 billion, they're all skinny. Why? Because white rice is only 1% calories from fat. Sweet potatoes, only 1% calorie from fat. Regular potatoes, 1% calorie from fat. So you want to be skinny? Eat a low percent of calories from fat. Anyways, here's my theory of dementia.
One thing that I did mean to ask you about this is my digestion seems to get worse when it's the lower the fat that I eat, my digestion seems to go downhill. Do you have any idea why that might happen?
Well, I'm not sure why that is, and I'm not sure what you're eating, but
basically starch solution. I actually add way more fruit than starch solution, but yeah, it's basically raw till 4.
Yeah, you might raw till 4, kind of like a Durian Rider type thing.
Yeah.
I'm not sure how to answer that. I do think fruit are better than McDougall thinks they are. McDougall's not too thrilled with fruit. What he says about fruit is it tastes too good and people eat too much of it, and that can cause problems with their weight. Plus, other fruit is expensive. It's hard to store. You might want to try eating more starch. I'm not sure what's giving you the problem with that. I'll let it percolate in my mind. Maybe I'll think of something off the top of my head. I'm not coming up with an answer to that. Okay, so here's what was, my theory of dementia. Basically, MR is metabolic rate for the neuron. GOD is glucose oxygen delivery. So obviously I could have called it OGD, oxygen glucose delivery. That's what it's usually called, but as a joke, I called it GOD. So basically, if you got less oxygen and glucose being delivered, for the reasons we talked about, lots of dietary sodium, et cetera, vasoconstriction, hypertension, all these other things, then you're not going to be able to make as much ATP energy, and that's going to make the brain more vulnerable to these things that overstimulate it, these excitotoxins. Also, if you got inhibition of your mitochondria, inhibition of the circle pump to get calcium out of the cytoplasm, all these things will start widening that gap. This is called neurovascular uncoupling. So normally there's coupling of the oxygen glucose delivery with the metabolic rate. But if you drop energy production, you start widening this gap, and then you ramp up metabolic rate, you widen this gap to the point where those neurons might start going into apoptosis. Okay. And by the way, I think this whole over medication of kids is insane. All right. These attention deficit meds, I think that's absolute BS. When I was a kid, by the way, I got suspended from school a whole bunch of times. I was not allowed to be in a regular classroom. I was put in a pod, and I had to be by myself, all alone in a room, sitting there by myself. And I was allowed to read books, but I was just put by myself all the time. And so what I'm trying to say is, if I was back in school nowadays, I'm sure they would have drugged the crap out of me.
Oh, yeah.
I would do the homework fast and be bored and want to joke around with my friends and have fun. I was just a regular little kid. Okay? Yeah. It's normal for a boy to sit in a desk for 8 hours a day, listening to some lady he doesn't even know her, talking about a bunch of irrelevant nonsense, and he's supposed to not fidget in his desk or want to joke with his friends. It's crazy.
It
So
is.
not only do they, you know, if you fidget, they drug you, they'll also try to castrate you nowadays. I think the public schools are a disgrace. I think they're terrible. They're awful. If you can avoid sending your kid, the best is to homeschool them. If you can't homeschool them, then, you know, maybe if you can get them to private school, maybe. Anyways, religious schools, what I noticed were, because I ended up getting later on sent into a Catholic school.
Yeah, same here.
Yeah, and I thought the Catholic school was good for me. Here's why. Because you had to behave. And what I mean by that is they didn't really teach much better than the public school. And they really didn't offer as many things as the public school. Public school has an economy of scale, bigger classroom stuff. But they made sure that you were nice to each other. They encouraged good values with charities and all this stuff. You had to have respect for others. And they were in charge of the hallway. In a public school, if you're in the hallway, there's fights. There's people hitting each other. There's people getting beat up. There's people getting their lunch money stolen. They're violent. Okay. But in the Catholic school, it was not like that. There were always adults in the hallway, and there was no misbehaving in the hallway. Also, in 7th grade at a public school, there's people having sex. There's people getting pregnant. There's people doing drugs. You go to the Catholic school, there's none of that. I was on all the sports team. I know all the kids. There was not a single person that year had sex. I would have heard about it. Not a single person. There was no drugs. Okay, so the kids behaved much better, much better. And I know how the kids grew up. You know, the kids did a lot better in terms of their ability to complete, you know, high school and get on with their lives. And they were nice kids. I know.
Yeah, I agree.
Nice people. Okay, so this was just one thing about leaky gut. You've got the main thing to cause leaky gut is a lack of dietary fiber, because the good bacteria, they need fiber to help the lining cells of the gut make their tight junctions. And so they take the dietary fiber, they convert it into something called butyrate, a short chain fatty acid. The butyrate is taken up by the lining cells of the gut, makes tight junctions so the gut stays intact. When the gut leaks, has holes in between these cells, I'm going to have a better slide of this in a moment, then big things can get in there. A bacteria itself, or LPS, bacterial toxin. And LPS is lipopolysaccharide. It comes from gram-negative bacteria. There's also something called LTA from gram-positive bacteria, lipoteichoic acid. Anyways, when both of those get into the blood, they cause problems. Here's what we were referring to earlier. This thing that looks like a slinky, that alpha helix, spiral configuration, cylindrical shape. And they'll distort the fibrinogen clotting proteins in the blood and make them flat. That's called beta-pleated sheet configuration. And then they all stick together and they form those amyloid clots. And those go around causing all kinds of problems. When you eat a high-fat meal, you get the plasma part. So here's your blood in a test tube. The red blood cells settle to the bottom. The white blood cells are in the middle, called the buffy coat. And then the plasma's on top. And usually it's translucent. Transparent. You can see through it.
Mm-hmm.
A high-fat meal, this is opaque. There was a movie called Game Changers where they had And most of the cells in the blood are red blood cells. There's about 700 red blood cells for every white blood cell. So the relevance of that is anything that happens to the red blood cell, it's a big deal for your blood. Okay, so now here's the first thing. When you eat a fat meal, the fat, and this is especially saturated fat, but just fat in general, it has a tendency to activate your neutrophils. And when your neutrophils get activated, they release something called MPO, myeloperoxidase. Now, this is your normal arterial lining. These are called endothelial cells, or the inner lining cells along the lumina of your arteries. And they got these little blue things coming up. We'll call those proteoglycans. So they're proteo meaning protein, glycan meaning like a structural carbohydrate. Okay, nothing about eating. It's a structural thing. And these negative lines here are for negative charge. That's called a zeta potential. Your arterial lining cells have a zeta potential, negative charge in them. And your white blood cells have a negative charge. And your red blood cells have a negative charge. It's called a zeta potential. And they all have negative charges on their outer surface, so they bounce off of each other. You don't want stuff sticking together. But the problem is activated neutrophils will release this MPO, myeloperoxidase. It'll come down and interact with these negative charges on the proteoglycans, and it'll cause them to collapse down as it binds to them. And the relevance is these green things down low that normally are not exposed to the flowing blood, they now become exposed when the proteoglycans have collapsed down. And they will then bind to white blood cells, and this can initiate clotting. You don't want that. Normally, this is happening after a fatty meal, and our body handles it using a lot of resources to handle it. But the more this goes on, the more chronic it is, the more the person starts forming blood clots. And by the way, I'm going to tell you a secret about atherosclerosis that you can ask your doctor, and I will bet you 99% likely your doctor does not know this, is ask them, what is atherosclerosis? They're going to talk, whoa, cholesterol, this or that. Atherosclerosis is a blood clot, and that's a very important thing to realize. By the way, I've been atherosclerosis for over 25 years.
Oh,
And
wow.
but the most important thing you can know about it is that it is a blood clot. And by the way, when you read about atherosclerosis, when you first start studying, I used to think this way too. Who knows the most about atherosclerosis? Well, the cardiologist, because the heart has atherosclerosis, and that's the most common cause of death. They work with it all the time. And I thought, well, and also besides the cardiologist, the vascular surgeon, they're always in the arteries, working with atherosclerosis, bypassing blockages. Okay, and the heart surgeon, they must know a lot about it. And there's also interventional radiologists. That's what I used to be as well, imaging guided surgeon, if you will, for the arteries in the legs. Okay, that's one of the things they do. So, anyways, the reason I go through all that is I used to think those were the experts of atherosclerosis, but here's what I learned. This is important to know. They're just a bunch of plumbers. Okay, they look at an artery as a pipe, and they ask themselves, if the pipe is blocked, what do we got to do? Can we put a catheter in there, a balloon, angioplasty it open, put a stent in there, hold it open? Should we do a surgical bypass, reroute a new pathway around the blockage? That's how they think. And that's nice, but that's not what atherosclerosis is about. Atherosclerosis is not just the big arteries on the outer surface of the heart and in other locations. It's every single little artery is needed to supply your brain, your heart, your legs, and everything. Your Johnson. Okay, so what's my point? The best experts on atherosclerosis are the pathologists. And then why is that? It's because a pathologist looks at it under a microscope. He just goes, hey, it's a blood clot. And in addition, a pathologist doesn't care how you treat it. If you have a cardiologist in a professional presentation has to say, and we think stents are great. Yeah. If he says stents stink, they'll run him out of town. If you can imagine a surgeon that said, I don't think we should do surgical bypass anymore, they'd go, shut up, you idiot. That's how we make our money. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. They have to toe the party line or they're out of business. So whereas a pathologist, he doesn't give a rat's tail. Treat it with diet, treat it with pills, treat it with a stent, treat it with surgery. He could care less. He just looks under a microscope and says, it's a blood clot. Okay. So I was amazed once I started reading the pathology literature on atherosclerosis. It was the best by far. And then I was able to make sense out of everything else. Because I look at atherosclerosis every single day, and I'm very used to dealing with it, and I've dealt with it for many years. But there were a lot of things I couldn't quite understand or put together. Once I understood it was a blood clot, everything made sense. And when you look at it on a CT, like a CT angiogram, you can't tell the difference between that and a blood clot because it is a blood clot. And then you say things yourself, well, how does a sickle cell anemia kid, 15 years old, get a heart attack? Because he forms a blood clot in his heart. Okay.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's a blood clot. How does a 40-year-old woman have a heart attack when she's otherwise healthy and she's got lupus? She gets a blood clot in the artery of her heart. Okay. So, all right. So anyways, here's diabetes, and the point that it's mostly, people think it's a sugar disease. It's mostly a fat disease. Excessive dietary fat is the main risk factor. Accumulates first abnormally in the skeletal muscle, and then that becomes insulin resistant. Then it accumulates in the liver, fatty liver. I think a fatty liver is being like diabetes of the liver. And then eventually you get fat accumulation in the pancreas, and you lose the function of the pancreatic beta cells to make insulin, and then they become insulin dependent. And that's an oversimplification, but it's a good basic structural understanding of diabetes phases or stages, you could call them. Okay, sometimes this is called the ectopic fat theory, but if you just get this, if you get this point, this is an important thing to get. Excessive bodily fat, and everybody has their own threshold at which they become diabetic, is really important for causing diabetes and for reversing it. It's pretty routine. You look at a CAT scan to see fatty atrophy of the pancreas. The pancreas tissue has been replaced by fat, and that's a bad sign that you're more likely to have irreversible diabetes, insulin-dependent diabetes. Okay, so here was the slides on insulin resistance.
So you can't reverse that at all?
It's going to be harder to. The more fatty atrophy you have, meaning that the pancreatic cells are dead and gone, the less likely you could ever reverse it. And what I'm getting at, though, is when you first go into pancreas failure, if you will, that not all of those cells are dead. They could be dysfunctional for multiple other reasons. Eventually, they die and become replaced by fat. So what's relevant is the sooner a person gets their act together, the better chance they can get complete reversal of their diabetes and not end up stuck on medications and injections and all that stuff.
How would you know? Like, without doing a CAT scan, how would you know?
Well, you won't know for sure if you got fatty atrophy there, but the things you can do, you can check, hemoglobin A1C to see if you're diabetic or not. If you're pre-diabetic, 5.5 to 6.5, about in that ballpark, pre-diabetic. If you're over 6.5, you're diabetic. If you're over, let's say 7.5 or something, then you're poorly controlled diabetic. So hemoglobin A1C can tell you how your blood glucose has been. That's an easy test to obtain. There's more tests you could do. You could check, what is your insulin levels and all this other stuff. You can do an oxygen glucose tolerance test. But my basic thought is that if you've eaten the Western diet for a couple decades, you've got all these Westernized problems. So, before searching around, because I know a lot of places and a lot of lectures will tell you, get this test and this test and this test and this test and this CAT scan and this X-ray and all this stuff. My attitude is, you got it. start treating it. Go low fat, low sodium vegan. That's the smart move to do.
What's low sodium to you?
When I say sodium, I just don't add any sodium to anything. I don't count the amount. I just don't add sodium to anything.
Okay.
But I don't count the amount. Because a lot of people say, well, you're at high risk for coronary artery disease. You need to go get a calcium CAT scan of your heart. And you know what I think of that? Bullshit. Okay, so why would I say bullshit? Because look at our teeth. They're flat, okay? Look at our jaw, go side to side. That's the physiology of a herbivore. Take a look at a horse's mouth. It's the same thing. You already know you got it. Why expose your heart to radiation? I don't know how many CAT scans that is, 1,000 or something. There's different ways to count it and look at it. There's different types of CAT scans of the heart. There's the ones without IV contrast, which just show you the calcium. It's a calcium scoring cardiac CT. And then there's the ones where they inject contrast and they image the heart in real time. That's much more radiation. But what I'm saying is you don't need a test. You know you got it, okay? Yeah. So start treating it and then follow with your blood total cholesterol. What I'm basically telling you is how to get stuff done cheap, trying to save you money and also save you bullshit. Because what do I see with people? Most people, they have no idea what's going on, none. And every hospital in the Western world, in the morning, it has a giant line of people like a river. And most of them are fat and pre-diabetic, diabetic, and hypertensive. And they all flow into the hospital and they go for all these tests, blood tests, colonoscopy, CAT scan, ultrasound, plain film, and test. Okay, how many people are in line to become low-fat, low-sodium vegans? Zero? Yeah. 1 out of 10,000? And there's your cure. We talked about coronary artery disease. What's the cure rate for pills? 0%. What's the cure rate for stent? 0%. What's the cure rate for surgery? 0%. What's the cure rate for low-fat, low-sodium vegan and with no oils? It's close to 100%. The Esselstyn data, for example, okay? The Framingham data, because that'll keep your total cholesterol below 150. What I'm saying is there's where you get the most return on your investment. But everybody likes going for all these tests. Yeah, stick a tube up my butt, stick one down my throat, take all my blood. I mean, that's not going to make you get better. I mean, maybe you need that. Maybe you have a clinical dilemma and you need to figure that out. I mean, I check my total cholesterol. I only check it like once every 5 years now because it's always great. But what I'm saying is sometimes you need information. You need to know what your blood pressure is. You need to know your total cholesterol. You need to know your B12 level, your serum ferritin. That's fine. But you don't cure yourself by getting a test. You just get information that you might need. Okay, so you cure yourself or have a chance to cure yourself, optimize your health by getting your act together on your diet and all these other lifestyle things. Get your exercise, get your sleep, etc. Okay, so anyways, insulin binds the insulin receptor on the cell, sends a signal to the glucose type 4 transporters. They go up to the plasma membrane. They form a channel in the membrane. The glucose comes into the cell. That's normal function of insulin after eating a meal. In a skeletal muscle, a lot of that glucose is going to be stored as glycogen. Okay, excess dietary fat will inhibit electron transport. It's especially bad with saturated fat. There's other types of fat will end up causing insulin resistance as well, but especially saturated fat is the worst. Okay, then this will start to go backwards. You'll start to leak electrons down here and form what are called reactive oxygen species, free radicals. That'll cause something called oxidative stress. You don't need to know the details, just know it's bad. And then why is it that you got to reduce dietary fat? Because they've shown here, for example, they tried inhibiting the fatty acid transporters in the plasma membrane, and they found that the fat was still getting into the cells. And the reason is it appears that saturated fat in particular, but other types of fat, I don't actually know for sure all the other types of fats, but I know sat fat will do this. And I would expect the other ones too. They'll intercalate into the outer leaflet. They'll flip into the inner leaflet. Then they'll go into the cytoplasm. And it didn't really matter what you did to inhibit all the plasma membrane proteins. They were just coming through the membrane on their own. They call this the flip-flop maneuver. And so the relevance is there's nothing you could do but reduce dietary fat. Otherwise, you're going to get more fat going into that muscle. Okay, here's what insulin resistance is all about. Let's say we showed that diagram a moment ago of fat inhibiting mitochondrial function. The mitochondria sends a signal, they call it an overnutrition signal, to the plasma membrane. Hey, I've got too many biomolecules of food here to work with. I cannot handle anything more. Do not bring any more glucose into the cell. So the glucose 4 transporters are blocked. And think of this red being like a stoplight. Yeah. So they were there, and now the glucose is bouncing off. So that's an overnutrition signal. And so that's what insulin resistance is all about. One thing that comes up a lot is people ask about fructose. Why is fructose bad? Does that mean you can't eat fruits? And I think fruits are different than high fructose corn syrup, because in a fruit, it's sort of packaged with the antidote, is what Lustig likes to say. And the gist of it being that a fruit doesn't have that much fructose. It's also packaged with other nutrients. You have to chew it. It has got fiber in there. But then let's just compare that with glucose. Okay, so here's glucose coming into the liver. And glucose doesn't, after you eat, glucose doesn't just go to liver, it goes all over your body, to your brain, etc. Your brain wants glucose. But the fructose, let's say high fructose corn syrup, it goes straight to your liver. It goes right through the portal vein from your gut, portal vein to liver. And here's why this ends up being a big deal. When glucose goes to the liver, the glucose is very carefully in control of, the liver is very carefully in control of glucose. It says, we need some energy. Let's burn some glucose. You know what? We got plenty of energy. Let's store the glucose as glycogen in the liver. It handles glucose perfectly under normal circumstances. Not like that with a bolus of high fructose corn syrup. So when glucose comes in, it'll initially be, there's 6 carbon sugars. Both fructose and glucose are 6 carbon sugars. It'll get phosphorylated, and there's a regulatory enzyme here, PFK, is phosphofructokinase. And that phosphofructokinase will only let this pathway run if it really needs to burn the glucose. If not, it'll say, nope, we don't need it. All right. Whereas fructose is not like that. Fructose comes in, it does get phosphorylated, but it then gets broken into 3 carbon sugars. So split in half, and it enters glycolysis at the 3 carbon phase. And the relevance is that there are no significant regulatory steps in the second half of glycolysis. So while glucose is tightly controlled and well managed, fructose, when it comes in large amounts, like you drink some sweetened drink with this high fructose corn syrup, there's no fiber in there. There's not much nutrients. It just zoom. It goes real quickly. It's absorbed from your gut and your portal vein into your liver, into the 3 carbon phase, runs to the end of glycolysis. And the liver's like, what the hell is this? I didn't ask for this. Why'd you make all this end product? Let's say pyruvate acetyl-CoA. It says, I don't need this. Make it into fat. I have no other purpose for this. Just make it into fat. Fat's how you store stuff.
Yeah.
Okay. It causes fatty liver. It's also initial metabolism is different than glucose. The ADP, a phosphate was given off here to make the fructose and the fructose 1-phosphate. This ADP generated from the ATP losing a phosphate becomes uric acid. And it's relevant because it elevates your uric acid. Uric acid is a bridging molecule. It gets red blood cells to stick together. It also inhibits endothelial nitric oxide, so it causes vasoconstriction. That vasoconstriction caused by the uric acid contributes to insulin resistance because insulin itself activates nitric oxide to vasodilate the muscles. The reason why it does that is because you have to open up the capillaries in the muscles in order to be able to deliver the glycogen, deliver the glucose. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
You can't get, if normally your capillaries and your muscles are going to be closed while you're resting because you're not using the muscle. It doesn't need much blood flow. So you have the insulin that says, hey, open up nitric oxide. Let's open up all these little vessels. I'm going to deliver some glucose for you guys. And then the uric acid does the opposite. It's shutting them back down. So now that glucose can't get to the muscles effectively, and you get higher blood glucose levels postprandial after eating all this fructose. So that's why high fructose corn syrup is bad. I won't eat anything with it in there because I'm also worried it's often contaminated with mercury.
But that does not happen when you eat fruit.
They think it doesn't happen that much with fruit, and I think it's because it's a slower process. And I also sometimes get a little confused in the sense that I've seen a lot of really healthy people with fruits, and these are people even that eat tons of fruit.
Yeah.
But I do worry a little bit. I'll tell you what I notice about fruit. Fruit tastes so good, you can kind of overeat it without stopping. And I think that's partly because fructose also, it doesn't shut down your hunger drive. It doesn't affect your hunger drive as well as starch satisfies your hunger drive pretty well. It's low caloric density, stretches your stomach, so you get early satiety from that. And then you get slow peeling off of the fiber from the glucose that's slowly absorbed in your blood, like a slow release energy pill. So you satisfy your hunger with the fewest calories versus with fruits, you could overeat fruits kind of fast. I think we probably all had this experience. I know, like, I quit eating apples initially a couple of years ago because I found myself, I would have 5, then I'd have 10, I'd eat 2 bags, and I still would want more. It doesn't shut off your hunger that well, and they taste good, so you want to keep eating them. I think one has to be a little bit careful about that fruits can get them to overeat, and that can cause a weight gain.
So you believe in calories in, calories out then?
No, definitely not.
Okay.
I think I think starch is the way to go because you satisfy your hunger with fewer calories. What I'm basically saying is, what I see as a potential problem with fruit is if you have unlimited quantities, unless you exercise a lot of these people who eat tons of fruit, they're exercising like crazy, triathletes. There's this guy from Hawaii, Michael Arnstein, who moved to Hawaii so he could have more fruit. He's running ultra marathons. Okay. He's running 30 miles a day. So he needs more calories. But for a regular person who's not exercising anywhere in that ballpark, the danger of the fruit is you don't want to stop. It just tastes good. Yeah, I'll have one more. And you overeat. I know I overeat because let's say I normally eat this quantity of fruit. Let's say I don't have my starch because it's not made for me, or I don't have it. I forgot to go to the store. I know I can just eat tons of fruit. I can easily eat double the amount that I normally would eat. I don't think about it. Whereas I can't do that with starch. It takes effort to eat a potato, to eat rice, to eat all these beans. I can't overeat them that much because they fill me up and you just can't do it. Whereas the fruit, I can keep going.
Yeah, I can hear that. I understand that one.
Yeah, this is some research done with both saturated fat and with omega-6 cooking oils. This came out of the 1950s. There's a guy by the name of Peter Quo, a cardiologist in Pennsylvania. And when he fed the people, this was done with people who had coronary artery angina, meaning that they get chest pain on exertion, dyspnea on exertion, okay? And due to their coronary artery disease, atherosclerosis in their heart. And what he did was he would check their blood fat levels, cholesterol level, and triglycerides, chylomicrons. They would check that every 30 minutes after eating a fat meal. And he found that the peak lipids in their blood would be about 4 to 7 hours. And during that time, they would get chest pain. The most common time for them to get chest pain is right when these lipids were peaked in their blood. Okay, because the fats stick in the red blood cells together. And so then Ansel Keys sort of figured out sat fat's bad in the 1950s. 1960s, they're like, hey, how about unsaturated fat? These are PUFAs, polyunsaturated fatty acids. And it comes with all these oils, all these different cooking oils. And so they fed them the omega-6 cooking oils. And what they found was they would start these experiments like at 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock in the morning. And they were expecting to go home in the afternoon, go home at 5 o'clock or something, but they couldn't because the lipids stayed so high. The workers started getting pissed off because the amount of blood sludge would stay high for such a prolonged amount of time. So I think these cooking oils are a disaster. They're much worse than people realize. I won't eat one drop of them. I agree with Esselstyn. No oil, not one drop. All this oil publicity is BS. I think because omega-3s and olive oil get all this positive press, because they're billion-dollar food products.
Yeah.
A lot of people think there's something good about them. I personally recommend avoiding them. And by the way, when you eat fiber, your gut bacteria convert those into short-chain fatty acids. We talked about the butyrate already. That's 4-carbon, but there's also a 3-carbon propionate and there's a 2-carbon acetate. Those go right through your portal vein to your liver, and your liver does with them whatever it needs. So what I'm saying is you will get fat just because there are some omega-3s, there are some omega-6 in any type of plant foods. And the fiber generates everything else that you would need for your liver can make it. So you don't need to go searching out all these supplements with all their side effects. Laminar flow, normally the red blood cells are in the center. White blood cells are here, and then the plasma's on the side. It's got a sort of like a parabola. It's a parabolic blood velocity profile. Here's the red blood cells stuck together by a bridging molecule like LDL cholesterol, or uric acid, or fibrinogen, or IgM antibodies with an infection. So anyways, when they come up, if they come up hypertensive, they hit these median dividers too hard. So this is a typical bifurcation of the body. Here's a common carotid artery in the neck. External carotid artery goes to the face. Internal carotid artery goes to the brain. Median divider is sort of the tissue in between where the bifurcation is. When the blood pressure is too high, these hit excessively hard. They bounce off of here, and that's called turbulent flow. That's chaotic. And then there's retrograde currents called eddy currents. And when you get an abnormal excess of turbulent flow and retrograde eddy currents, you will start to shed glycocalyx, antithrombotic glycocalyx with all its negative zeta potential charges on it. And you'll start to express those sticky molecules, like I showed you that adhesion molecule, selectin, for the white blood cell earlier. And you'll form clots along this far wall. I look at CT angiograms of the head and neck all the time. And I can tell you this is exactly where it happens. I see that all the time. And it's a blood clot. It's indistinguishable from a blood clot. Okay, and then you end up with a steady state between clot formation, clot dissolution. And so you don't want these things. But that's how it happens. And that's where it happens. In the coronary artery, too, it happens right at the bifurcations. Now, this is a little bit more stuff. I showed earlier that brain cell that couldn't get enough glucose in because of these glucose type 4 transporters. And so I actually should have had this one come first. So here's the glucose 1 transporters that just sit there in the cells, allowing glucose to go right from the body to the brain through these glucose type 1 transporters across the BBB, blood-brain barrier. And then you got glucose 3 transporters on the plasma membrane of the neuron, and those also let glucose in, but there's not enough of them to get all the glucose that the neuron needs. It also needs GLUT4s. And like we were talking about, these GLUT4s are typically in a vesicle within the plasma membrane and don't come up until they're needed. So that's why insulin resistance is a very big deal for the brain cells. Oh, this was just one more cell about leaky gut. So here's a normal gut, single cell lining cells. The gut's called the enteric tract. So these are called enterocytes. Site means cell. This is entero means gut. They got TJs between them. That's a tight junction. And that's a big deal because that means nothing can get in between them. They usually have a protective mucus layer as well. The inner mucus layer has all these antimicrobial proteins, AMPs, secretory IgAs, these antibodies, all this stuff to protect that gut lining. And then the good bacteria, I drew them with smiley faces here. They eat the fiber and they make them into short chain fatty acids, usually abbreviated SCFA. So again, 2 carbon acetates, 3 carbon propionates. These ones go to the liver. The liver makes them into whatever the body needs. And then the 4 carbon ones are called butyrate. And those are made into tight junctions by these enterocyte cells. And that's what protects your gut. That's normal, good gut function. Okay. Now, on the other hand, you got all these things right here are things that cause leaky gut. And when that's going on, that means the tight junctions are broken apart. And now these purple things are the bacteria. They can get into the subendothelial space. The macrophage of the immune system tries to eat them and get them out of the way. They produce toxins like this LPS, lipopolysaccharide, and that can cause all kinds of terrible inflammation, and it can get into the blood. This is so-called postprandial. Prandial means eating. So postprandial means after eating. Endotoxemia means bacterial endotoxins increasing in the blood, and they cause a lot of problems. They can cause clotting. And you might have a minimal amount under a normal circumstance, but after a high-fat meal, routine high-fat meals, you get more and more of these things, and they cause more and more problems, more blood clotting and other problems, and you'll start getting some bacteria in your blood. Also, normally you don't digest anything more than 3 amino acids at a time. When you have leaky gut, you can absorb big chunks of protein. So 3 at a time would be a tripeptide, if you will. Yeah. So big chunks of protein, they can cause problems because your immune system says, hey, why is this big chunk of protein coming in here? And it'll form an antibody to this big chunk of protein. But there's something called molecular mimicry, meaning that it's different enough, because it's not from our own body, it's coming from an animal. It's different enough that the immune system recognizes it as foreign, but it's similar enough because it's from an animal, its amino acid sequences aren't that different than ours, that potentially that antibody is going to cross-react with tissue in our own body. So this is the most common mechanism of autoimmune disease.
Yep.
Leaky gut, abnormal absorption of large pieces of animal protein, antibody formation, then molecular mimicry, similarity of the amino acid sequence. Proteins like a string of pearls with amino acids along the string, if you will. Okay, and then they cross-react with our own body, and they cause autoimmune disease. The antibodies attack our own body, okay? These word PAMPs and DAMPs means this is pathogen-associated molecular patterns, meaning it's an infecting thing. MAMPs is like microbial-associated molecular patterns. Okay, so anyways, the immune system recognizes these molecules don't belong in our body. So anyways, that's that molecular mimicry with autoantibody cross-reactivity. There's autoimmune disease right there. There's other causes, but that's the most important one to know. So basically, if somebody's got an autoimmune disease, what do you want to do? You want to avoid all this stuff. If I had an autoimmune disease, I actually make sure I avoid all of it anyways. But if somebody has an autoimmune disease, this would be my first priority, avoiding all this stuff. Like if you don't use oil for cooking, I don't even think you need a dishwasher. But if a plate of mine is rinsed in a dishwasher, I'll rinse the soap off, because dishwasher soap, all soaps, and they're like emulsifiers, meaning they're part aqueous and they're part lipid. And so they do that because they hold processed food together, okay? But they also contribute to causing leaky gut. Just like I showed you that fatty acid earlier that intercalated and crossed the plasma membrane of a skeletal muscle cell. These can also cause problems with the membranes of your intestinal lining cells, your enterocytes. So anyways, there's a whole bunch of causes of leaky gut. It's wise to avoid all of them. These LPS go around causing amyloid blood clots. And if the bacteria get in, then you get an infection, or if a virus gets into you, you'll get infection problems that also cause amyloid blood clots, and those cause all kinds of problems. Okay, and that's basically all I had for slides.
Quite interesting.
Thanks.
I mean, that's a lot of stuff. So, I mean, now autoimmune issues, why most people have issues with thyroid, right? Because they'll have like a thyroid gland come through, if they eat, hot dogs or something like that, and then it attacks that, and it starts attacking your own thyroid.
I think that's the main problem is leaky gut with autoimmune disease, like you just mentioned. But then I think other things contribute to it. For example, soy is goitrogenic. That contributes to autoimmune disease. And a lot of these other estrogenic chemicals have a component that is also goitrogenic. So it's good to avoid all that stuff. I actually think it's good to try to be kind of simple, kind of live like Adam and Eve, but keep your indoor heating and plumbing.
I know people had questions, so let me find those.
The other thing is, I think, once you make the decision to do stuff, try for a month or 2 or 3 to go all out. the reason I say that is a lot of people only kind of go half butt, half ass. And what happens is, let's say you got an ability to heal 3 steps up in a day, in a week. If you're also keeping your old bad habits, you're going to knock yourself back down and you're going to feel like, gee, I'm not making any progress. But if you go all out, 100% vegan, 100% low fat, no salt added, no caffeine, you'll have a chance to make some real progress, and then you'll feel more motivated to continue. But most people, they have a tendency to just go, well, everything in moderation. I'm cutting down on oil. I'm cutting down. In my experience, those people usually don't do well. So it's important to make a real commitment.
Yeah. Do you think they should start out with starch?
Oh, yeah. I think you got to figure out what type of starch works for you. I like potatoes, sweet potatoes, and white rice because they're all 1% fat.
Yeah.
And that's going to help you stay thin. Because I think a lot of people, too, who knows what happened? Their mom ate a lot of MSG when she was pregnant, and that's predisposing them to weight gain the rest of their life. Okay, maybe they've been exposed to a lot of estrogenic chemicals. That's predisposing them to weight gain the rest of their life. They used to eat lots of oils with omega-6 fats, and there's a Japanese neuroscientist, Tetsumori Yamashima. He claims that excessive eating of omega-6 cooking oils leads to a sequence of lipid peroxidation steps where the hydroxynonenal has a tendency to damage the hypothalamus, the arcuate nucleus, the hunger center. And so he says a person who's done this for a long time, they might have a hard time ever losing weight because they just can't control their appetite so well. So what I'm saying is that might be any one of us. And so you're going to have to work extra harder if that's your situation. And so if that's a person's situation, well, then get your act together as best you can. And like I said, those 1% fat starches, that's the lowest percent fat of any foods. I think that'll give you a much better chance.
Yeah. All right. So I have one here. It says, ask if you think apple cider vinegar is good or is it bad for your teeth?
I don't know. I've heard good things about apple cider vinegar, but I'm always kind of suspicious whenever I hear something good about a profitable product. You know what I mean? Because there's always industry-funded research to say the thing's good. Yes, I have heard good things about it, but I don't take it myself. I don't know if it's good or not. I'm not a big fan of gimmicks just because I say to myself, what did our ancestors do? They ran around all day in the forest looking for something to eat. They didn't take any supplements. They didn't do anything fancy. And so, maybe there's something good about it. I don't know.
What's your thoughts on smoothies?
Well, I'm not that big a fan. And the reason I say that is because the machines are so noisy. I don't like noise. Okay. I'm a little bit like Arthur Schopenhauer. Arthur Schopenhauer said you can basically estimate a person's intellect by how much they don't like noise. And the relevance being that the blender's so damn loud. I have some family members who they want to improve their health, but they don't want to go vegan, but they make one big shake every day. And I was telling, I bought them ear protectors. I go, because you're going to go deaf is what I tell them. And also let me know I can get out of the kitchen and go put my ear protectors on.
Yeah.
I hate that loud noise. Real quick, it spins up. I worry about them going deaf. And it's better to just eat the food. But I know some people say they won't eat the food. I have also heard of some patients claim it improves their health. I heard some cancer patients say it helped them. They eat more fruits and vegetables this way. Okay, fine. But it makes sure at least you got this,
Yeah. Long-term weight loss and set points, how to overcome those along the way. I guess they're looking at set points. I know McDougall talked about this.
Yeah, I do think we have a set point.
Yeah.
I think we've got a set point in our hypothalamus, the hunger centers, the arcuate nucleus. And what I mentioned a moment ago, though, was some people, there's such a thing as epigenetics, meaning that the diet and conditions the mother was exposed to have an effect on the baby. Plus, if you've been eating, omega-6 cooking oils for decades, you might have had damage to your hypothalamus hunger center. So it's going to be harder for you to optimally set it. When you talk about, a billion out of a billion rice eaters being skinny, they've been eating white rice since they were born. They never had exposure to all these omega-6 things and all these other food processing chemicals. So what I'm saying is always assume that things are going to be on the tough side for you and just go 100% out. So like I said, the thing that's most likely to make you skinny is eating very low percentage fat foods. White rice, there's less fat in white rice than brown rice because there's less fat in the outer part, when you take that outer part. So white rice, sweet potatoes, regular potatoes, they all got 1% fat and they're starches. That's about as good as you could do. And the beans in particular got tons of fiber. So they really satisfy hunger a prolonged amount of times. As far as beans, I'd recommend you start with lentils because lentils are only 3% fat.
Oh, okay.
Black beans are about 4% fat. Garbanzos taste good, but they're about 13% fat. That's still a reasonable food. I think soy is a terrible food. got a much higher percent of calories from fat. I don't know if it's 37% or something, but it's pretty high. There's all kinds of weird things about soy. I think soy is a really bad food. I would stay away from it completely. But anyways, what I'm saying is if you're going to eat beans, lentils or black beans, for example, they taste great if you mix them with the potatoes. They taste great, mix them with rice. They give real prolonged satisfaction of hunger. I found that I like the OMAD diet, 1 meal a day diet, just because a lot of times I have to work all day. It's a long day. I come home and then I'll eat the OMAD diet, rice, beans, potatoes, sometimes sweet potatoes. I'll have some fruits and I'll have a salad. That's a pretty typical night for me. And that works. I feel good. I think it's because of the beans more so than anything else. I'm not hungry at all. I know if you look at the liver ability to maintain blood glucose level and not go into ketosis, it easily handles that for one day, walk in the park, and it handles it pretty well for 48 hours. So to eat once a day is pretty easy. I do it all the time. So anyways, and that's convenient because you eat at night. I don't think this breakfast is important. I think that's nonsense. That was promoted by the breakfast food making companies. Okay. They wanted everybody to eat breakfast because they sell their stuff. So, because normally, in the morning, you don't feel that hungry. And I think it's because you get this little bolus of cortisol and whatnot. The reason why I don't want to waste the morning is when you're smart. The smartest you're ever going to get is right when you wake up in the morning. So whatever you've got to do that requires your brain, you want to do it in the morning. And then if you got to go to work, I don't want to have to wake up earlier because once you start eating, then you have to afterwards defecate or whatever you have to make, prepare. It's a mess, clean your teeth. That's a lot of time. Do you really want to wake up that much earlier before you go to work and then you're going to fall asleep in the car driving to work? No, just wake up. You're going to be fine. Go to work and eat when you come home. That works. Now, don't get me wrong. In a perfect world, it'd be nice to eat a lunch sometimes. But I found that even on my weekdays, I used to like eating twice a day. Nowadays, I don't tend to. I just find it convenient to eat the OMAD diet. It's been working for me. I'm happy with it. Everything is good. So if it's not broke, I don't want to fix it.
Exactly. Do you think you live off cortisol all day though?
No, I'm perfectly fine. My total cholesterol is like 90 to 110. I'm 60 years old.
Yeah.
I'm strong. I can concentrate all day long. I had one thing I'll just tell you about that. I sometimes lift weights with some young guys and I have an old shoulder injury. So I can't bench press. And, they give me a hard time. You guys tease each other. They're like, look at your chest and shoulder development. You're freaking weak. You're old man, stuff like that. And I'm like, well, I can't do bench press. And that's what they care about is how much they can bench press and squat and stuff like that. But I can do push-ups. And sort of my baseline was I couldn't break 50 for a long time. And I didn't really care. But I said, okay, I'm going to see so starting about 5 months ago, I started doing all these tricks to do push-ups. And I got my push-ups up to, I just did 78 in one set. And the reason I mentioned that is everybody says vegans are all weak because all these guys think vegans are a bunch of pussies. They're like women, they're all a bunch of hippies and drug addicts. They say, don't even say that word vegan in my presence is how these young guys are. They think, high meat is where it's at to be a macho man. And so what I'm laughing about, and then why do I tell it? Because I'm like, how many push-ups can you? Now, I know they don't care about push-ups. They don't train in push-ups, but the strongest of them can only do 56. The other ones, can't break 50 even. So I'm having fun with that because it's a refutation of all vegans are weak, wimps and all that stuff. So and look at there's a lot of triathletes that are 100% vegan. Yeah. Tata Ramada, who are running 100 miles in 2 days, incredible energy. They're all 100%. Well, they're about 95% vegan. But I just mentioned that. I think all the stuff about saying old people need to eat, I'm 60. They're saying old people need more protein. I think that's all BS. The reason is they want to sell stuff. So in order to sell something, you got to tell people there's a problem. Look, you're sarcopenic, you're muscle depleted, you're going to die prematurely, you're weak, you're helpless. That's BS. You can be quite energetic and strong eating a plant-based diet.
Do you think estrogen in dairy is more or less feminizing than soy?
Probably I would guess that the dairy's worse. It might be a little closer to being activating our estrogen receptors more because, milk is closer to us than is soy.
Yeah.
Human breast milk only has about 5 or 6% fat. I do think a lot of kids do go into premature puberty because they keep drinking this whole milk, but it's also been shown that soy causes premature puberty too. In the modern world, all the soy industry funds all these papers that say soy is good, but when you read the old papers, there's tons of problems with it. I would never eat it. I actually think the reason why soy is subsidized and also the atrazine on the corn and the F- in the water is to make the population low IQ and infertile. Okay, I don't think it's a coincidence. MSG does the same thing. No, it's everything is going in that direction. They believe that the average prole serf peasant is a useless eater and a waste of the world's resources and would be better off if there are fewer of them. I think that's just a fact. So as an individual, don't expect any help coming from the outside. Learn how to help yourself.
Uh, would you eat organic bread with only 3 ingredients and without salt, just organic wheat flour, yeast, water, and other ingredients?
Only if I made it myself. The reason I say that is whenever there's two or more ingredients, they can put MSG into the second ingredient. They don't have to tell you. So if
Hmm.
you make it yourself with single ingredient things and mix it yourself together, fine. But I stopped eating breads and cereals for that reason, that they almost always had MSG in them. They almost always had oils in them. They almost always had high sodium in them. So it's sort of like, why bother? I mean, if you could buy single ingredient foods and make it yourself, then it would be different.
And the last one here is actually kind of the reverse of what I asked. Why is low-fat vegan so good on the digestion?
I don't quite know why, but I know my digestion, everything improved a lot. And what I thought was happening was if you're still eating a little bit of meat-based products, you're kind of, I think, having a competition between your gut flora, the good bacteria and the bad bacteria, if you will. And if, let's say, you have meat for dinner and a plant, let's say, for lunch, okay, those bacteria, because the good bacteria, they largely feed on fiber, which comes from all your plant foods. And then processed food and meat have hardly any fiber. So if you're going back and forth between what gut flora is going to predominate, then you're going to get episodes of bloating and discomfort and whatever goes with that, constipation perhaps, versus my gut just totally calmed down because I eat the same thing all the time, just one meal a day. That has been working well for me. One thing I'd watch out for is, your food could have pesticides sprayed on it. It could have herbicides sprayed on it. Yeah. The water you're drinking could have stuff in it if it's not well filtered and the source. So there could be those other things contributing to it.
That's actually all the questions I had. I was more interested in your dementia talk because I've been seeing it on your channel. So, is there anything else that you wanted to add to all this?
That's pretty much it. We covered, I think, some of the main issues.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm just gonna end it here. I'm sure you'll be back on here whenever the questions
Oh, my
arise.
pleasure. I'm always happy to chat with an Irishman.
All right. So anyway, that's all I've got. Check his channel out. Go like, subscribe, and comments, questions like always down below. And that's it. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, well, thank you.